Okay, so what inspired me to write this piece? I know it's kind of an esoteric thing, the Grail myth, the myth of the Holy Grail. And it wasn't, I think, something I would have come to on my own, except that I am part of this international community of women called the Grail. And we were having a 50th anniversary of our property, of our center in Ohio, called Grailville. And they asked me to write a piece, a poetry ritual theater piece, for the event. So I started to do research. It took at least a year to gather a lot of research together. And in the course of the research, I was discovering so much symbolism and complexity and mystery in relation to the Grail myth itself, because the truth is I really didn't know a lot about it, no more than other people who may have seen Monty Python or the Raiders of the Lost Ark or that kind of stuff. I knew there were knights, they went out, they were looking for a cup, and some got it, some didn't. That's what I knew. Except for one thing, I also understood that there was something in the myth that somehow the journey was more important than the thing itself that they were going for, that something was going to happen in the journey that would, in fact, be the attainment of this Grail. So I found that interesting at a spiritual level. And as I was doing my research, I kept uncovering more and more in terms of the way it had been influenced, first of all, by the Celtic peoples and those earlier Druidic pre-Christian times, when in fact this cup was actually a cauldron and the horn of plenty, and there were these fertility rituals that would take place every year, and it somehow was affirming and celebrating the balance of the male and the female within society, and the rituals were based on the premise that without this balance you couldn't have harmony, you couldn't have a viable social structure, not to mention an earth that would return to fertility each year. So I went from the Celtic influences and then understood that a big influence on the Grail myth were the Crusades. And all of the stuff coming in from Islam and the Middle East and from even the Orient. And then finally, when you get down to some of the writers in the early part of the 1200s, they were using alchemy and tarot and astrology and numbers and all these mystical sciences. So I suddenly saw how this Grail myth was connected to all these different forms of mysticism. And I became very intrigued. I became very intrigued by the ideas and very intrigued by the symbols. And so as I'm reading, I was trying to extract what was essential in this myth. Because I knew I didn't want to talk about the knights. I knew that. What I was trying to find was the way, how would this apply for a community of women who call themselves the Grail? So this was the challenge. And to do it without violating the knights or the search, but to somehow find something more essential than that. And a big help was Jessie Weston's research. She's a prominent scholar from the 1920s, and T.S. Eliot refers to her a lot in his poem, The Wasteland. And she was the one who brought forth this vegetation theory, that these stories didn't start out as stories, they started out as an early fertility ritual. And that the stories are remnants, and they are part of the memory of that ritual time and the balance of sovereignty between men and women that it represented. So I said, well, why not have a ritual that would be a return to that idea of regeneration, of rebirth? And so I tried to find what were the basic themes in all of the different Grail stories. And I came down to the idea of the journey, which will ultimately bring you into the wasteland. There's no way we can avoid it. And in the story, the knights always end up there. And that wasteland ultimately makes you ask questions, like, how did I get here? Like, how do I get out of here? Like, what's really wrong with me, or what's really wrong with them? Or somehow you keep asking questions. And the challenge, of course, as it is in the myth, it is also true in real life. What's the right question? It's like not about any question. You had to come up with the right question. And if you found the right question, you could heal the wounded king, you could heal the land, and you could attain the Grail. So the challenge was always not the answer, but finding the right question. So in the piece, I move from the journey into the wasteland, into the question, which ultimately leads us out in the quest. Because once we've got our question, not our answer, but our question, we go forth on the quest for what the answer may be. And ultimately that can bring us. This is our hope, this is our faith. It will bring us to the light, which in fact is the Grail. The Grail, when it appears in the myth, always appears in this most radiant, most blissful giving light, and a sense of fulfillment of all of your longings. A sense of completion and coming into union with something that is greater than yourself, but also is part of yourself. And I call it the circle and the light because I start out in the circle. Instead of the chalice and the blade, I went for the circle and the light because I like the idea of getting even more essential than the chalice. It's really about the circle, the circular form. All of life is built on the circle and on the spiral. No life exists without this basic form, whether at the micro level or in the cosmic level. And it's representative of paradise, of some original union, which all of the myths also have spoken of. Each of them has a story about how the Grail was lost as the result of a fall from paradise, as a result of breaking this union, which is the true nature of reality. So the circle begins the piece, we move into the journey, the wasteland, the question, the quest, and then into the light. I like the idea of the light better than the blade. It seems to speak of the male principle, but a male principle that permeates and infuses at the same time that it goes forward. And this is that nobody knows what the nature of light is. It defies definition. It is matter, but it's also energy. It's a particle, but it's also a wave. So there's this great mystery of light that I feel gave me a lot of inspiration and desire to somehow create a ritual that we might be able to have an experience of what this Grail myth could tell us about our own search and in our own time. Because I also see here that intimately linked was the healing of the individual and the healing of the land, that you couldn't have one without the other. So on the one hand, it's a personal journey, but on the other hand, the fulfillment of that personal journey will ultimately bring all of us and our communities and our land back into abundance, back in fertility, back into fruition, back into union once again with the truth of what our journeys are really about. And so it's a prayer, and that's why I wrote it, and that's what inspired me, and that's it. And the cup is a female symbol. I didn't say that, but I just hope that's obvious, that people understand that, and that the search for the Grail is really the search for the divine feminine. That's the other part about the myth that makes it very female. And the knights, ironically, were dressed up in armor with swords to go out and find the divine feminine. This is the great irony of the stories. That's what this is. That's what this is. This is the Grail from a woman's point of view.